It comes as companies in China say they could be badly hit by the ongoing trade war with the US. Meanwhile, China's President Xi Jinping is on what's been called a charm offensive across Southeast Asia, visiting Vietnam, Malaysia and Cambodia.
The Donald Trump administration in the United States of America has overnight announced a massive escalation in tariffs imposed on Chinese imports to the United States of America, taking the US-China retaliatory tariff war altogether to a new level.
On April 17, 2025, the Trump administration sent shockwaves through the global trade community by announcing a bold and controversial move: new port fees on Chinese-built and Chinese-owned ships docking at US ports. This wasn't just another policy tweak. It was a targeted strike, a deliberate attempt to curb China's dominance in global shipbuilding and reassert American control over its economic and industrial future. Within hours, international trade experts, shipping companies, and U.S. importers were scrambling to understand what it meant for them and what the broader impact might be on the already strained global supply chain. At the core of this announcement lies a question of power: economic power, industrial leverage, and long-term national security. The administration's original proposal was staggering. It planned to impose fees of up to $1.5 million per port call on any vessel built in China. That's not a one-time charge. It would apply every time the ship docked. The maritime industry pushed back almost immediately. Leaders from shipping conglomerates, logistics firms, and international trade bodies raised alarms. Such steep costs, they warned, would create chaos in pricing, distort shipping routes, and almost certainly trickle down to affect U.S. consumers. Faced with the backlash, the administration recalibrated, but it didn't back down. Instead, it introduced a more refined, tiered fee structure that maintained the essence of the policy while softening its edges to avoid immediate disruption. Under the updated plan, ships that are built in China or owned by Chinese firms will now face fees starting at $50 per net ton or $120 per container, with these charges increasing annually for the next 3 years. For ships owned by non-Chinese firms, the fees are lower, starting at $18 per ton. The message is still clear. If your ship is tied to China, it's going to cost you more to do business in the United States. This tiered structure gives companies time to adjust, but it also introduces a permanent cost penalty that could reshape how cargo is moved globally. The fees will officially take effect on October 14, 2025, and each vessel will be charged a maximum of 6 times per year. For frequent shippers, that could still amount to a massive financial hit. To avoid total economic disruption, the administration carved out a number of strategic exemptions. Ships operating solely between U.S. domestic ports, the Caribbean, U.S. territories, or the Great Lakes are exempt. U.S.-based carriers like Matson and Seaboard Marine are also excluded from the fees. Foreign ships that arrive at American ports empty, only to load U.S. exports, will not be charged either. This move protects American exporters and avoids penalizing trade relationships that rely on outbound shipments. Additionally, liquefied natural gas, LNG carriers, are subject to a long-term plan requiring them to gradually integrate U.S.-built ships into their fleets. Starting at 1% of U.S. LNG exports within 4 years, that figure will rise to 15% by the year 2047. It's a slow ramp-up designed to inject demand into U.S. shipbuilding without shocking the system all at once. The foundation for this policy wasn't laid overnight. It stems from a comprehensive investigation initiated during the previous administration that found China was using aggressive and, in many cases, unfair tactics to dominate the global shipbuilding industry. Chinese shipyards benefit from heavy state subsidies, tax breaks, favorable lending conditions, and centralized government support. This has allowed them to offer ships at prices that other nations, including the U.S., struggle to match. Over time, China has built the world's largest fleet of commercial vessels, while American shipbuilding capacity has eroded. The Trump administration's port fee initiative is intended to reverse that trend by discouraging the use of Chinese-built ships and reigniting demand for American-made alternatives. Supporters of the policy argue that this is a necessary and overdue correction. They claim the U.S. cannot continue to depend on a geopolitical rival for something as critical as maritime infrastructure. In their view, the fees are not just about economics. They're about protecting national sovereignty and preventing the U.S. from becoming overly reliant on Chinese industrial output. They also point out that rebuilding the American shipbuilding industry could create thousands of high-paying jobs, stimulate investment in port infrastructure, and re-establish the U.S. as a global leader in maritime technology. For these advocates, the new fees are a signal of strength and strategic foresight. But critics aren't convinced. Many economists and trade analysts warn that these fees will raise shipping costs for importers, which in turn will raise prices for American consumers. At a time when inflation is still a pressing concern, even small increases in shipping costs can have outsized effects across the retail, manufacturing, and agricultural sectors. Some retailers have already warned that their supply chains will be disrupted, especially those that rely on affordable goods imported from Asia. Others note that smaller firms, those without the capital to quickly adapt, may struggle to survive in an environment where logistics costs are rising unpredictably. There's also the international dimension to consider. China has responded to previous Trump administration tariffs with steep retaliatory tariffs of its own, some reaching as high as 125%. And has restricted the export of rare earth materials and other critical resources. Trade experts fear that this latest policy could trigger another round of economic tit-for-tat. If China responds in kind, it could further destabilize global markets and heighten tensions between the two superpowers. Other nations that rely on Chinese-built ships might also see the U.S. fees as discriminatory, potentially leading to legal challenges through the World Trade Organization. Whether those challenges would succeed is an open question, especially if the U.S. frames the policy as a matter of national security. The geopolitical implications are impossible to ignore. In recent years, control over global shipping routes has become a focal point of strategic competition. China's Belt and Road Initiative, its growing control of international ports, and its investments in maritime infrastructure have all been interpreted as moves to gain long-term geopolitical influence. The U.S., by contrast, has lagged behind in asserting its presence on the seas. This new policy can be seen as an attempt to catch up, to reassert control, redirect trade flows, and ensure that America isn't caught off guard if international relations deteriorate further. The timing of the policy is particularly important, as global supply chains continue to adjust after the disruptions of the COVID-19 pandemic and various regional conflicts, adding more pressure to shipping systems could either accelerate long-term reform or cause short-term chaos. Logistics firms may respond by avoiding U.S. ports altogether, choosing to dock in Canadian or Mexican ports, and transporting goods across land. Others may start investing in ships built in countries not affected by the new fees, such as South Korea or Japan. Over time, this could reduce the number of Chinese-built vessels operating in U.S. waters. But it won't happen overnight. In the long run, the success of the policy will depend on whether it truly stimulates investment in American shipbuilding and leads to a sustainable shift in global logistics behavior. If it does, the administration will likely claim victory, portraying the fees as a masterstroke of industrial policy. But if costs rise, inflation worsens, and global trade slows down, critics will argue that the move was reckless and counterproductive. The next few months will be critical. Businesses are now racing to understand the implications, assess their options, and decide whether to absorb the costs, shift suppliers, or change routes entirely. What happens next could redefine the rules of global trade for decades to come.